If you're enjoying the Health Geeks Book Club podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, leave a like, rating, or review, whichever your preferred podcatcher platform allows.
This episode is sponsored by Well Balanced Nutrition and 360 Health.
Welcome to the Health Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
Oh, it's another day in the podcast studio.
Another day. Your West Virginia come out.
I like it.
Hey, y'all.
Oh, and I'm feeling good, even though it's rainy outside. We're looking out an overcast town, but the flag is flying and the construction teams are out. So, who's been reading out there? I hope everybody's been reading along with us. I've been thinking about reading since I did a lot of it in the last 2 days because I kind of procrastinated on a couple of the books that we're going to be exploring today. Kristen, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling good, yes. We do cram a whole lot of reading in each month, don't we?
Yeah, I think you said when you started this that you kind of wanted to increase your reading. Has that happened?
Absolutely. Definitely increase my reading.
Yeah. And anyway, so what are we going to dip into today?
Today we're going to talk about mitochondria and the future of medicine.
Oh, goody.
The key to understanding disease, chronic illness, aging, and life itself. Now, this book's from 2018, and it's by Lee No. He's an ND, which is a licensed naturopathic doctor based in Canada. And he's the recipient of several awards. He's known by his peers to be a strategic and forward-thinking entrepreneur and physician. He's held positions as medical advisor, scientific evaluator, and director of research and development for major organizations. So I came across this book, too, because it is part of continuing education for registered dietitians.
Oh, okay. I was thinking maybe I had influenced us to read this, but now I'm feeling better that you, too, had a reason to read it. Because I'm a biologist, and I love cellular biology. Mitochondria are pretty cool little critters. And so here's this, connection with the future of medicine and understanding disease, chronic illness, and all that stuff. It's like, okay, I want to know more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I get a big chunk of continuing education credits for taking an exam on this. And
well, I think he probably does too, because this book has something like 67 or more pages of bibliography.
It's a thick
It's huge.
section.
And when you look at the bibliography, the guy's looking at the Journal of Biochemistry. He's looking at proceedings in the National Academy of Science. He's looking in pharmacological toxicology, illustrated biochemistry. He's got tremendous depth of what I would call peer-reviewed literature supporting his conversation, and it's an in-depth bibliography. I was totally blown away when I looked at that.
Yes, and he said he could have made this book even bigger, but he had to stop himself.
Yeah.
and it took him 2 years of all this research.
Yeah. Well, he's kind of divided it into some interesting sections, too. It's just like part 1, part 2, and part 3, but I was taken with his Luke Skywalker Star Wars thing. Evidently, he's a brainiac, and sometimes these brainiacs get caught on that Star Wars thing. But he calls this the Force, and then chapter 2 is the dark side of the Force, and then the part 3 is nurturing the Force. And Tony Robbins has a book out. A lot of you may know Tony Robbins is a motivational speaker who's worked with lots of very prominent people, and he draws a huge crowd whenever he speaks. But his book is called The Force. So maybe one that we're going to look at. I don't know. And I don't want to start at the end, but the end of his book it just let me down because he brought it back to the Star Wars thing, and he says at the very end, mitochondrial medicine is a fascinating field and has real-life implications for countless health conditions and indeed for life itself. With greater knowledge in the coming years, we might be able to nurture the capital Force to the level of Anakin or Luke Skywalker. Just make sure you use your newfound power for good, peace, and love. Resist the dark side. And that's the end of his book, and I'm going, oh, come on, I wanted a better ending.
Yeah.
But that is, it is true. And he does talk about how science is not static. It changes.
Right, and this was from 2018, so as I'm reading it, I'm like, I wonder if anything else has come out since then. But So I bet our listeners are like, what is mitochondria?
Yeah.
Professor, can you give us a rundown?
Well, thank you for the compliment. And I will say that he also had a disclaimer in this book. Neither the author nor publisher is engaged in rendering professional advice. And I'll take the same disclaimer. This is my opinion and what I've experienced and what I kind of understand from the West Virginia perspective. As we talk.
Eleanor.
Okay, so, and I love my state. My state gets bad rap every now and then.
It does.
And it's a tremendous place to have experienced. So anyway, what is mitochondria? Well, when we look at the human body, we have to appreciate that we're multicellular. We're not a single cell organism. We're multicellular. So we got trillions of little cells, and they're organized in different types of tissue. There are 4 types of tissue, and then there's different organ systems, and then the organism itself. But anyway, down there at the cellular level, which we have great interest in right now, in wellness and in health maintenance and prevention, and then the treatment of disease, we're looking at intervening at the cellular level. So what's inside a single cell? There's a sort of consistency, and we are a group of organisms called eukaryotes, which means we have a membrane-bound nucleus inside our cell. So we have a cell membrane and a bunch of stuff floating around, and then a little nucleus that has a membrane around it. Other organisms don't necessarily have that, but we also have in that cytoplasm, that's the matrix that the nucleus is in, organelles that are also membrane bound. And so we have some peroxisomes, we've got endoplasmic reticulum, rough and smooth, and other things. But then there is an organelle called a mitochondria. And the mitochondria is typically referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. It's the thing that works on producing energy. And the way it does that is very complicated. And it takes a lot of study, in my opinion, to grasp it. So this book, I think, is written for people who have some foundation in that, because he goes right on into the intricacies of it. And if you haven't had a course or taken 6 months to think about this stuff, I'm not sure this book is going to be an easy read.
I'm not sure it's going to be an easy read for anyone.
Yeah. So anyway, the fun thing about the mitochondria is, and it's just gorgeous. I mean, when you look at it, it takes this adenosine triphosphate molecule, which can lose a phosphate and become adenosine diphosphate, and it can lose another phosphate group and become adenosine monophosphate, and then you can tack those phosphates back on there. And every time you tack a phosphate on, you're trapping energy in that molecule. And that's what the mitochondria is doing. It's pulling the phosphates off, putting the phosphates on, pulling them off, putting them on. And anyway, it's an intricate system, but it is the powerhouse. And the suggestion about knowing more about the mitochondria is going to help us address aging better, maybe, and fighting off disease. Does that help set what is a mitochondria?
Yeah, let me
have
summarize and simplify just a tad. Thank you for that. So inside of our cell, there's lots of different things going on, which is amazing because the cell is so tiny.
Yep, microscopic.
But one of those things inside of there is a bunch of mitochondria. There's several of them inside of a cell, and they're little powerhouses where they take food and oxygen and turn that into energy our body can use, and we call that energy ATP for short. So
and that's the adenosine triphosphate that I was talking about. Forgot to say that.
Yes.
ATP.
So if you Google it or YouTube it, there are some really cool animations of this, like, machinery.
Well, let me tell you, that's exactly what I said this book needed. He needs to get up with Philip Detmer, who wrote Immune, and he needs to add some color to this book and those infographics, because like what you're saying, once you see the animation, the abstract becomes understandable.
Right. So if this is interesting to you, check out those videos. And actually, Philip Detmer has a video
Does he?
On
yeah, I'm sure he did.
This.
Yeah. Who is my latest crush,
Yes, yes. What was interesting to me is the history of the way our cells came about, the eukaryotic cells.
Yeah.
So two became one, right? 2 bacterial cells. Instead of like eating the other one.
Oh, you mean you're talking about evolution here?
Well, this is how he starts the book here.
Yeah, and he does talk about, he has a minute in there where he talks about evolution, and then he also talks about the spiritual side and the other theories of how we have come to be. But he and I think I liked him doing that because I thought he honored that other perspective. Mm-hmm. But then he goes on with his conversation. So I'm sorry, I interrupted.
That's okay.
So there's two bacteria.
And, instead of eating the other bacteria, they just became two living together.
They formed an alliance.
Exactly.
They were a cooperative relationship is what it was.
Cooperative relationship. And so that's how we have evolved, and our mitochondria have become energy-producing factories.
Yeah, and in that incorporation into the other cell, and bacteria's DNA is not like the eukaryotic DNA. Mm-hmm. We have long strands, and the mitochondrial DNA is circular, which is like the bacterial DNA, a more plasmid type circular thing, and it's much more simple and it's not as complicated. And that was interesting too, talking about how the mitochondria over time gets rid of extra DNA that it doesn't need.
It was definitely interesting. So the energy factories are very important to our health and play a role if they are damaged or not functioning well in many diseases. And that's the basis of the book that Leno goes into.
Yeah, when I was talking about that loss of DNA, I did appreciate Dr. No's saying something about the fact that bacteria acquire genes through lateral gene transfer, which is the way that they can pick up more DNA if they need it and let go of it and share it, so they don't have to hold it inside. He thinks big agri and biotech industries need to do far more research before genetically engineered crops and animals are entered into the food chain. The engineered genes can be picked up by the bacteria in our gut or in the bacteria in our livestock's gut, and there are countless other ways those genes could escape and wreak irreversible havoc throughout the animal and plant kingdoms. And, a lot of us are a little bit concerned about how quickly we're moving into the GMO experiment. And he then also says that the ability of these mitochondria to share genes, inside the bacteria or the other cells, it can explain how antibiotic resistance can spread so quickly throughout a population. So I think, as he said, we're going to learn more about this, but we are doing things right now that could have an interesting effect on our well-being. You said that there's more than one bacteria in a cell. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they divide, right? Mm-hmm. And they tend to do that when you need more energy.
Right.
There's some signaling that says, hey, we need some more, so why don't you guys divide? And, how does that all coordinate? It's amazing. Conquer. Yeah, and it's this reductionist thinking that we can actually, we can figure everything out, which is another reason I think he waved his hand at the spiritual stuff, because I think when you're looking down at the infinity of the microscope versus the infinity of the telescope, either way you go, you can't explain the end point. You're never going to hit it.
There's so much that we don't know.
Yeah.
Even as we continue to know more.
And is it Neil deGrasse? Is that the guy's name?
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yes. He says we know 4% of what's possible to know, if that's even a calculation you can make. So here we are,
If anybody can make it, he can make it.
Oh, okay. But that idea that we're going to get down into this chemical and atomic discussion, and it's going to solve our problems as a whole organism living a life in a society, which, I struggle with that because I love this stuff. I mean, intellectually, it's very entertaining.
It is.
When you say that, entertaining, mm-hmm. Do you mean you don't know that you believe it, you just find it?
No, I think you can reproduce it. I mean,
okay.
I do think that, you can. Well, okay, these are still theories because we're at the electron microscope when we're looking at the interior of a mitochondria. It has an outer membrane and inner membrane that folds, and it's called cristae. And then there are these little molecular machines that live on those surfaces. And what's fascinating is they create a electrochemical gradient. And he has a nice little picture of a reservoir and a hydroelectric plant, and then electricity coming out of that, because once you pump a whole bunch of proteins out, they get to be so many, they flood back across the membrane, and when they do that, they drive these chemical reactions, and electrons pop off, and then they're transported in these cytochromes down. This is getting pretty technical.
It's
Cytochrome
totally
1, 3, 5.
complicated at such a small level.
Yeah, and we really can't. It's still theory at a level.
It's beyond me that we know so much goes on at such a tiny level.
Subatomic, yeah.
Yeah.
Because that whole idea of moving a hydrogen ion, which is a proton, pull an electron off, make a proton, then you got a proton pump. But anyway, they're getting to where they're talking about nutritional therapies, using this understanding of what we're doing.
Yes, because every step of this energy or ATP production can run optimally with proper nutrients.
Yep.
So,
and oxygen.
And oxygen. So in their absence, the cell's forced to produce energy in a less efficient manner, which compromises the viability of the entire cell. And then you get cells that have to either die off or become dysfunctional and
don't do the job they're supposed to do. And then the system doesn't work so well.
Right.
Yeah. So kicking this back up a level, we hear a lot about the ketogenic diet and the idea of eating a lot of fat. And, there are other people that say that doesn't sound quite right. And because maybe that would clog up your arteries, if you have the cholesterols and triglycerides that are products of that. So he talks about the beta oxidation of the fats and bringing in calories from fat. And it really is efficient. It is not a bad thing. Do you have any opinion about what he was talking about of the ketogenic stuff? Because that's a nutritional program.
Right. I'm not a huge fan of the ketogenic diet, but it was fascinating to see at the cellular level why it's efficient, right? I think it was like 60 to 70% more.
Than the glucose, which is a carbohydrate. Glucose is the molecule that drives into these chemical pathways. If you've ever heard of the Krebs cycle or the tricarboxylate.
I just say TCA.
Yeah. It'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, yeah, TCA. But Dr. Krebs was pretty cool and got a Nobel Prize for figuring it out. And it was the first circular chemical pathway that somebody figured out. So that was really fun because the end product feeds the beginning product. So anyway, that was a sidebar. The keto thing, I'm a little concerned about it as well, even though it's good energy. It seems like the kidneys they could be damaging to kidneys if you maintain that for too long. I like my kidney function.
Yeah, I think there's just still too much we don't know. There is more research on keto.
Yeah. And the idea is to tap into your fat body. That's what I think people are experiencing. They will lose weight on the ketogenic diet, and it'll be their fat body, not necessarily their muscle, which has a good outcome for them to maybe feel better. But when we read Dr. Davis's book, The Supersized Lies, I think he and other authors that we're reading say 2 years down the road, it doesn't matter how you lost your weight.
Yeah, and that was what I was about to say, is that it's very rare that it's kept off because diets don't stay.
Yeah. And so I think, protecting your kidneys if you can is a good idea, is what I was thinking. And your cardiovascular system if you're eating too many of the other things.
And while we're on the topic of diets, he does go into calorie restriction a couple times in the book and how that's the best way to prolong our lifespan. Is that what he's saying? But then when he gets into the research, it's all on animals. So I don't know how much I can buy into that when calorie reduction is like by 40% and it's only tested on animals and other species, and we're humans.
Yeah,
not mice.
You remember Dan Buckner wrote The Blue Zones? And the Greek monks, didn't they have a low caloric intake? They ate like a little, very small meal once or twice a day, and that was it. And they had longevity. So I think, this idea of calorie restriction has been noticed, and we're exploring it.
Mm-hmm. And it has to be nutrient-dense foods.
Yes.
Or otherwise you're facing malnutrition.
Yes, exactly, because those elements that come in, like the magnesium and iron and iodine, if you're not eating those food sources that would provide that, oh man, you're not going to be able to function at
Your
the
mitochondria is going to
biochemical level.
less
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I wonder about iodine deficiencies now because we have all these fashionable salts that people are eating, and they're not iodized. And most people don't eat seaweed, which is another good source of iodine. And it's kind of hard to find iodine in the diet. Maybe you have some other sources you could suggest to people if they're using those fancy salts.
Well, it's even hard to find the salt.
Mm-hmm. It's iodized?
Uh-huh.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's challenging. I've had some people tell me, like, I can't find iodized salt.
Ooh. Well, good to know. I'll have to make sure that I have a stash. Okay, I had a really interesting thing happen. I was volunteering at the local Chamber of Commerce bike ride.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and in this book, he talks about the athletes and how they seem to have better health because they're pushing their bodies, they're exercising, right? Mm-hmm. They're consuming more energy. The mitochondria are dividing, a lot more mitochondria, and they should be healthier, right? We think they are.
Right.
And I think he comes down to a conclusion of maybe we don't need to push ourselves so far. That 30-minute walk a day, every day, or an active lifestyle where you're moving through the day is going to serve us better than maybe getting on a bike and riding 60 miles, which is what I saw. The loop was a 30-mile loop and a 60-mile loop, and I got there for the cleanup. I was on cleanup duty. And there was this fellow who was mature, I would say, little snow on the roof, and just soaked, and he was laid out. And his bike was flown over on the side, and there was nobody around him. And I said, "Are you okay? How are you feeling there?" He says, "Not good." I said, "Oh, okay. Let me see what I can do to sit here with you for a little bit. You got a phone that's got a charger, charge phone?" Because there was nobody around, and I was picking up some water bottles that were left, and I said, "Would you like some water?" Yes. Well, it didn't have any electrolytes in it. It was pure water. Mm-hmm. So the guy's sweat. He did. Maybe I shouldn't have done the 60-mile loop. And I thought, yeah, maybe not. And it took him a long time. He completed it. He did it. But the recovery for him was awful. So what they talk about in here is called ischemia reperfusion injury. And I thought he might be experiencing that because what happens is, according to Dr. No, that sounds interesting.
It is.
Yeah. Is that down there at the mitochondrial level, you tap out your supply of the ADP molecule to hook the ATP on it. It's like you get out of balance on the molecule that's going to create the energy for the muscle cells. Mm-hmm. And that taps out. And when that goes away, then these cytochromes, because you're bringing in enough oxygen, because he's breathing, so he's got the oxygen, which would be a limiting factor of this whole system.
Right, and for energy, we need oxygen and the nutrients.
Yeah, right, and so he's consumed the nutrients, and then that molecule that we're trying to hook that phosphate on with the energy that we're burning from that glucose, or the fatty acid, beta oxidation, is not available. He's tapped all that out, and he gets a superoxide rush, which they're saying then damages all this mitochondria even more. And so they've had people, in this book, they're talking about in cardiac surgery. In some cases, such as a planned cardiac surgery, we can prepare for IRI, which is the ischemia reperfusion injury, and take measures to reduce the damage by priming the cells and mitochondria for this added stress through interventions such as nutritional therapy. In most cases, such as a heart attack or stroke, there's no advance warning, and so protective preparations aren't in place. And then they lose people when they shouldn't lose people. And then these athletes also, there's so many stories of these wonderfully conditioned athletes dropping over dead with a heart attack. And this is what he's offering as an idea for that. And it kind of made sense to me.
Yeah, and it's the D-ribose that he's wanting you to supplement
with,
right?
Yeah.
Because that
can
pentose, speed up your
phosphate
recovery.
Shunt. Yeah, but I remember when Lance Armstrong was popular before he kind of did the blood doping thing and kind of fell from favor. He was a cyclist that everybody was watching because he was unbelievable in these high altitude races in France or wherever he went. He was winning these races. And as an anatomy teacher, I used to use chest x-ray of his because he had what most of us would call cardiomegaly. His heart was huge. And I remember as an early fitness trainer, we were doing ergonometric studies, and we were saying, you want to build the heart muscle. You want to make it bigger so that it's stronger and it can pump more blood with each stroke. So you start saving those heartbeats, and you get your resting heartbeat down to 60, which is not normal for most people. And so it made sense until this idea of maybe if you get too big of a heart. And then I also wonder about aging. When you quit that exercise and if you've pushed your heart so big, what happens then? Does it get floppy?
I think there's been, some of it was drugs, but there were professional athletes, but wrestlers, professional wrestlers that have died.
By the way, this is Tim jumping in.
Yeah, I'm sorry, producer Tim. That have had heart attacks because of weakened hearts, because a lot of it they had done steroids to beef themselves up, and then when they stopped, it stopped, and their heart did too.
Yep. Yeah. So you do have to be careful.
You do.
Absolutely. And supervision of a third party is often good.
Yep.
Yes. So that's what I was going to say about the exercise thing, because I'm interested in, because I am promoting an active lifestyle. But I do think there needs to be some limits on the push, maybe.
Yes. I think there's two interesting things in here about exercises. One is what you were saying, and what clicked in my mind is, you hear of maybe like a high school football player or basketball player that just kind of had a heart attack in the middle of practice, and you're like, how can a healthy young person have that happen? And so this kind of explains how, if you're always pushing yourself and never have that recovery, then you can have that damage to your heart. The other thing about exercise that I thought was neat is that, background on this first is that as we make energy in the mitochondria, we pass along these electrons. And they can leak out of the system, and they can cause oxidative stress. So we hear about free radicals coming from the environment or toxic chemicals or our food, but they can actually be leaking out of our cells or out of the mitochondria and cause problems for us. And so the more food that we eat and the less we use up that energy, the more opportunity we have for this leakage and free radical damage. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about, calorie restriction, how, like in a famine, right, we see that calorie restriction. And to make energy in our body, we need oxygen and food. And so they have oxygen, they just don't have a lot of food. But they see an improvement in free radicals coming out in the body. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Am I being clear with that?
Yeah.
And so on the flip side, you see athletes who are eating and then expending that energy. And so that is helpful as long as we're not overdoing it.
Right. Yeah. And that thing about aerobic and anaerobic respiration are kind of interesting too. If you don't have oxygen, you resort to the anaerobic, which is really the first step in that energy pathway. Glycolysis occurs and you don't get much ATP out of that. You get like 2 molecules compared to 36 out of the aerobic pathway. So if you can use your aerobic pathway, it's going to be better for you. And so if you're thrown back into that anaerobic, you get fatigue. So if you're lifting weights, they talk about, we want to drive you into anaerobic glycolysis. So we're going to lift these weights and you start to sting and burn, and that's that lactic acid buildup. And he does talk about the lactic acid changing the pH, which then, anytime you modulate the acid-base profile of the body fluids, it changes chemical reactions and molecule shapes. So we like to keep our pHs in a really narrow range, and that's why we have respiration. We blow off some carbon dioxide, and we urinate some things. So we get rid of some of these things that are, the hydrogens that are changing our pH. But yeah, the aerobic respiration is important, and bring the oxygen in is what is required for that. It's the final electron receptor. If you don't have the oxygen, then that whole thing backs up, and then that mitochondria is damaged. And then they're saying that doesn't have just effects on our cardiovascular or exercise capacity. It can affect our neurons, and so some of these diseases like neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, this fella is drawing some information into that. How these beta amyloid deposits or plaques in our brain are probably byproducts of dysfunctional mitochondria. And the mitochondria can be programmed, or all of our cells are programmed to die. It's apoptosis. And so when the signals are such that this is a dysfunctional cell, the immune system, we read about that in Immune, will identify this cell as having trouble and will get rid of it. And so the mitochondria inside the cell will get rid of themselves. They will just break up.
And then be recycled and reused. Well, this is a really heavy topic, and if you're still with us, thanks for hanging in there. Let's simplify this, and we might go into another episode because there's definitely more here. But let's give our listener maybe a couple takeaways that were cool from this book. So mine is that, at this cellular level, we don't really think about all that is happening for our health. And when we exercise, when we eat a balanced diet, that thing is affecting those things are affecting how we're aging and how well we are functioning and producing energy.
As are all those other things like rest, sleep,
yes.
Laughing, less stress, less external stress as well as internal. We've been talking about internal stresses, but the externals that most of us live in America, also complicate the mitochondrial function.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So don't take for granted all the little things going on at the cellular level in your body.
Yeah. I also wanted to say we tripped into another author in here. He refers to Dr. Steven Sinatra, a cardiologist. And I said, geez, I've heard that name. I think I've heard that name. And I have. He's a co-author on our book, Earthing.
Oh, I didn't put that connection
together. So
I
thought, I need to know more about this Dr. Sinatra because he's being referenced pretty heavily in the cardiovascular discussion in this book. And I always love it when we run across doctors. He also has, Dr. No has a section in here on cancer and how the mitochondria play a role in the cancer thing. And I would love to get him together with Jason Fung, because Jason Fung had a discussion in his book about how in cancer the cells revert to that primitive state that he was talking about at the beginning of the story of evolution. They revert back to an individual organism rather than a multicellular organism. And they're living inside of us, these cancer cells. So I thought that would be a good conversation for those two guys, and I would love to hear it.
Absolutely.
So my takeaway is this book is complicated. I think he's on to a really hot topic that we do need to know more about and we'll be learning more about. I would like to have seen, a little more colorful presentation. There was just something about it that was a little too academic for the general public.
Oh, 100%. Not recommended for the general public.
Although if you're out there and you have a science background, don't avoid this book.
No, if you're a registered dietitian listening, it's really good information. It takes you back to your college years and the Krebs cycle and good continuing education. Mm-hmm. But for just our common health geek, I don't know if you would want to pick up this book. It'd probably be a little overwhelming. Yeah,
it's kind of what I'm saying about you could know all this stuff, but how's it going to influence what you do in your day-to-day living as a human being? And exactly. there I go. Is like, okay, we operate as a organization of systems, an ecosystem, and we got bacteria living in us, and we experience all sorts of shocks during the day, and we put things in our body, on our body, and around our body. And so I'm Eleanor at 360 Health, and I like to help people consider what they're putting in, on, or around their body, and let you have some confidence that I do this kind of reading, and if you don't want to do it, I'm going to be able to help you. So we can continue our conversation. Just go to my website, 360healthforyou.com, and put in a little contact there, and I'll get back to you.
Yes, Eleanor knows her stuff, and somebody told me that she is the smartest person they know.
Who was
and
that?
I thought that. I agree. You are so smart.
Well, I don't think that's true. I have that disclaimer. Let me read that again.
Give yourself more credit than that. Well, I'm Kristen Norton, one of 3 of the registered dietitians at Well Balanced Nutrition. If you're tired of feeling confused and overwhelmed by nutrition advice, visit our blog and check out our free monthly webinars for practical and simplified tips from the experts. We are at www.wellbalancednutrition.com. And that's all we have for you today on Mitochondria. Thanks for listening.
Stay tuned.
The views and opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the expressed written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.